We are ranchers at King Hill. We have a cow-calf operation with my parents, and then alongside my husband and I. And we have been using virtual fencing for about 60 days now, which doesn't sound like much, but is probably very relatable to many of you guys. Okay, so the reason that we're using this is fire recovery. So earlier this past summer, on July 25th, we had our first fire in one of our winter permits. It was the 20-mile fire, as you can see, a little over 4,000 acres. And it's this area here. So anything in this black, the yellow is what is still able to be grazed. This is not the first time that we've had fire. We run our cattle on the BLM in the Jarvis field office. Fire is a very, very common thing for us. I'm sure as for many of you as well. So we figured to ourselves, well, we have other areas that we can winter our cows. This is inconvenient, but it's not the end of the world for us. Then about 10 days later, we had another fire in the other section of our winter allotment. So this was the basin fire. It was a little over 6,000 acres, and it burned this area here. So the yellow is still what is able for us to be grazed. Now, because of a number of different factors, one of those being the fact that the Oregon Trail runs through both of these permits and allotments, the other fact that we also have oil and natural gas pipelines that go through those. And then in that last one, that is a county road that cuts through the middle of that allotment. So fencing wasn't necessarily an option for us just because of the logistics of all of that. We would have had to put in a cattle guard. Again, crossing the Oregon Trail isn't ideal with those pipelines. There would have had to be a number of access points. So fencing wasn't an option for us. And as you can imagine, this late into our grazing season, because we have to start weaning in the beginning of October, we had kind of ran out of options. After this fire had happened to us, we were like, well, there went our plan B and our plan C. So now what are we going to do? So we did find a couple of other places to run the majority of our herd, but there were 150 animals that we, through work with our BLM office, were able to put collars on, and we're using virtual fencing with them. Obviously, the financial impact in something like this is a huge aspect for us and for all of you who are here today. So how collars work is they are on a subscription model, just like Netflix. You pay for them on an annual basis. So it's $40 a year for the collar itself. With that also comes basically like direct customer service through Merck or Vents, the company that the company is Vents, but it's owned by Merck. So if I had a problem today, I can text my customer relations specialist and she is going to get back to me. So you also have full access. It's not something that you're given this stuff and then you have to figure out what to do with it. So that is part of that $40 subscription. Then you have an additional $10 per battery. Batteries last 6 to 9 months. So for us, because we're only using this over the course of the winter, we only have to worry about one battery. So for us, the collar is $50 a year. If you were somebody who you had a number of fences or your cattle were hitting those fences a lot, obviously more electric pulses, that's going to decrease that battery life. So then somebody would potentially need 2 batteries. So you can see that that is how that all works. The base station or the tower, the cost of that is $12,500. We did not have to buy a tower because the Shoshone field office had done some work in a virtual grazing project a couple of years ago, and they had a tower that they allowed us to borrow because we are the first people in the Jarvis field office to ever have used this technology, and especially in the element of fire recovery. So the annual cost for 150 cows, as you can see there, is $6,000 for the collar. For us, it was $1,500 for the batteries. Comparing that to my brother-in-law puts in fence. I asked him last week what a mile of fence was, $24,000. I want to be my brother in another life because that would be some pretty good money to make, right? So you can imagine that had fencing been an option for us, that would have been an extreme cost. And then winter hay, as you can see there, for us to feed those cows hay, it would have been $26,000. Plus that also does not include if we would have had to go stick those on some corn stalks or something of that nature to like physically have a place to put those cows. we also would have had to pay a lease for that as well. So that number would only grow. So as you can see, as far as the financial impact of this, virtual fencing does make a lot of sense in this situation. To break it down again, this is something that is from vents themselves, because the average customer has about 15,000 acres, which would require 2 towers and about 300 head. So this is that cost breakdown, again, just on a little bit larger of a scale. Again, we didn't have to buy the tower. We only have used 1 tower so far, and that's worked well for our area. But this is, again, just kind of another breakdown of that cost. So you guys are probably wondering, well, how do you put collars on cows and how exactly does this work? And I will say, when it comes to our ranching operation, we are a well-oiled machine. We know exactly what we're doing, why we're doing. If something is wrong, we are definitely going to change things, but we are not changing just for the sake of change, if you will. So this was a pretty big deal for us. My parents are in their 70s and their 80s. They are not into technology at all. But with my husband and I being able to help be involved in this, it obviously made it a lot easier for them to make that decision. And it was a great decision for us to take part in. So the collaring itself, it takes 2 to 3 days prior. We put those batteries in. It took 3 of us, or there were 4 of us. It took us about an hour and a half to put all 150 batteries in the collars. They look very similar to like a flashlight battery, if you will. And then you use a drill to drill them back on. We'll see how easy it is to get them off, to change those batteries. But that's exactly what vents, how they had told us to do it. It also helped to have extra hands on the collaring day. Katie and a couple other people from our BLM office actually came out to help us put the links on and the breakaway links. So the collar itself, how it works is most of us have probably seen how a dog collar, that whole system works. It's very similar. This collar though is chain link, but it has plastic breakaway collars. So if a cow were to get caught on something, the plastic link is going to break away, the collar is going to come free, and she's not going to get herself in any kind of issue. When I asked vents, because we did this the same day that we pregged, and I asked them, I said, well, how long is it going to take for us to put a collar on a cow? Because our vet he is a well-oiled machine. And I didn't want him to be delayed in what he was doing and it to be an inconvenience to him. And she was like, you can do it in about 30 seconds. I thought, you are wrong. She was right. I was wrong. You can actually do it in about 30 seconds. And I wish that this video would work. But if you guys have any questions, you want to see it, I'm happy to send it to you. It's a really easy process. Basically, 2 people walk on either side of the cow. You put your arms together. My husband would take it, link it on, check to make sure that it's the right number of links, and she's good to go. We did specifically choose to collar younger animals just because we know young cows are a little bit maybe more receptive to change versus an old cow. She knows exactly where she's going in that allotment and nothing is going to stop her. So that's why we chose young cows. It has worked really well for us. The training phase. So you do have to train your cows, which who can actually train a cow, but it works. So how this works is on day 1, you make the actual hard fence hot. So this right here is the hard fence where you see the difference in the pasture and the cornfield. That was hot. And then this would be a hard fence, but we did not keep this hot because there's a water tank down there closer to my parents' house. And you don't want any kind of a stimulation, obviously, next to a water tank. So these cattle just had 3 sides that were hot. So for the first day, it is only the hard fence line that is hot. On day 2, you bring the vents in 10 meters away from the hard fence. So you bring it in 10 meters, and that's where a cow is going to get that electric stimulation if she tries to go past that 10-meter point. And when you walked out of my parents' house on their yard, because this is obviously right next to their house, it was amazing to see these cows grazing in a line that is imaginary that they had not gone past. Like, I thought, holy cow, on the first day, it's actually working. So then on day 3, you don't move the fence itself. So it's still in that 10 meters. But what you do is you add a sound with that. So basically, you know how with a dog collar, instead of giving them the shock, you're ideally going to give them the tone first so that they hear, okay, what I'm doing is wrong, and I don't want to do this anymore, to then prevent the shock from happening or that electric stimulation. It works the same. So the fence doesn't change. You just add in that additional tone or sound so that the cow knows what would be coming if they continued to move forward. And then on day 4, you cut the field in half using vents. Now, we didn't get to cut it in half just because we didn't have the size that was needed for 150 head of cows to cut that in half. They would have been on top of each other. It would not have worked that well. So we just brought it in about this much. And as you can see, in 4 days, our cows basically knew what they were doing. And these are also cows. They're out on the range. We gather them in the spring to brand them. We obviously check water and we move them as needed. And then we gather them in the fall. So we don't, like, we see them often, but we don't interact with them like if they were pasture cows where you're moving them all the time. So I'm not going to say they're wild, but they're also not going to come up for pets like someone's backyard cow, which is, again, probably very similar to most of us. So if our cows can learn this, I would say anybody's can. So how the base station works is it can be moved by hand by 2 to 3 people, as long as they've got some muscle. It can fit on a UTV trailer or inside of a horse trailer if needed. The tall part there that you see on the end, you can unwire that antenna to put it inside of something like a horse trailer. Then obviously you're going to have to wire it back up. In the 3 periods that we've moved it, we haven't wanted to unwire it, so we've just been very gentle with like strategically placing it so that it's not going to get damaged. It takes us about 45 minutes to an hour to disassemble and reassemble after we've moved it. We do call vents to make sure once we get it to a new place that it is connected and online and they can see the tower, because we've worked with them to like the strategic placement points of where you would put it. So we had a meeting with vents a couple of months ago before we started this process and said, these are the fields that we want to graze. We broke them into pieces. And then they said, based on the logistics, these are the 3 spots that you'll want to put that base station. So then based on that long and lat, we go out there and that's where we put the base station. We call vents. We say, hey, is it reconnected? They say yes. And then we can move those cows in theory. It does have batteries, and we just unhook the batteries, put them in the back of the pickup, and then move the tower itself just to take off some weight. Otherwise, it would be quite a bit heavier. And then as far as service, you do need cell service for the base station to work. It can be any carrier. It doesn't have to be whatever carrier you use. It is, as long as there is some kind of signal, basically like a 911 call, right? It just needs any kind of signal. This would be the same type of situation. So here's some grazing data. So this would have been November 14th to 21st. So what is that, 7 days? We were in this first field right here for 3 weeks. That line that you can see coming from the top and coming into this field, that's when we trailed those cows from home. I think that that's a really important thing to note, because as you can see, there's some dots that are out here on the other side. GPS is not always right. We know that. If you put a long and lat on your phone and then you give it to somebody else, it may actually place you 10 feet away or 50 feet away. Like, nothing is actually perfect or spot on. Those are hard fence lines on that farm. We know that our cows did not get out there. So those little instances is just that the GPS location on that collar being a little bit off. One of the things that I thought was of interest is in this first field. So this is on top of, if you guys have ever passed by the Paradise Valley exit, there's a farm up on top called Black Mesa. This is right next to that Black Mesa farm. There's a really big draw down in here, and this is where our cattle winter. And they always want to go down in that draw. It's probably 5 degrees warmer. There's absolutely no wind. Most of you probably know how the wind blows in Glenns Ferry. It is brutal. So that's always where our cows are. So we were a little bit worried in this first field about, well, they're just going to want to go down in this draw where they basically want to winter all month long, because it has such milder conditions. And all that's stopping them are these virtual fences off the burn, which is over here. And then this virtual fence that is stopping them from what is edible grass. There's no burn underneath here. In the first 3 days, we had 3 cows go outside of the vents. They went down to water in that draw where there is a water tank, which is where most cattle would winter or would water if we didn't have a virtual fence. And they came back through the vents. They never left again. And I think a lot of that has to do with the idea that cattle, they have this herd mentality. They want to be with the rest of the herd. So if these cows up here can see that there are no other cows where they want to go, they're not going to go there. They want to stay with their herd. One of the other things that was really interesting in this other photo that you can see. So this is the area, this black area where a cow would be shocked. This is white area is where they would get the sound. And you can see a very definitive line, with the exception of a couple bad actors, who did not want to penetrate that sound. And this would have been in the first week that we were using that technology. So again, to say that you can't train cattle, they did respond very, very well to that. I thought it was also really interesting on the grazing data side of things. In this field, there's water down here that we haul water to, and there's water up there that we haul water to. And there were some cattle that would graze all of this area and they'd only water here. There were some cattle that would graze all the area, they'd water at both places. You can also see that some are lazier than lazy and they only come out about like 100 feet from water or whatever it is, like they've never left this area. But it was really interesting to see how our cattle graze in these areas, because up until having this knowledge, we never would have known. So my final thoughts are, as mentioned, it gives us more data on how, when, and where our cattle graze, allowing us to become better resource managers. It can obviously be a very cost-effective option, especially compared to fencing, or if you're going to feed hay, because we know if you spend that cost on hay, you are not getting it back. Your cow is eating that money. At least with fencing, there is some kind of hard asset that you have. You still have those posts and the wire, but with hay, you're not getting anything back. And then our cows were definitely quick learners. A couple of negatives. It does take pre-planning. So over the weekend, we had to move cows to what would have been the first fire, so the last field that we'll be using with our vents. And the evening before, I changed the collars so that the cattle could go through the vents. It takes about 2 to 3 hours to update. So if my dad wakes up one day and says, hey, we're going to go move cows today, pump the brakes. Like you have to give me enough time to make sure that the collars can update their new instructions. So I usually try to be a little bit more on the cautious side. I try to do it the night before to where that way everybody has enough time to update. So we moved the tower on Friday. I had set the collar instructions Thursday night. We moved the tower on Friday, and then we moved cows on Saturday. I will say it definitely cannot replace the need for hard fence lines. And that kind of goes into that next point of, it is not a technology that would work if you were running in common with other people. So if you wanted to keep your cattle and your bulls kind of in a central area and not mix with your neighbors, that's not going to work, because every cow in the herd needs to be collared. Otherwise, because again, kind of going back to that herd mentality, if a cow sees another cow out there where she wants to go, she's still going to go there. So again, in situations like that, it would never be able to replace those perimeter fence lines between us and our neighbors. It would never work in areas where we run in common with people. But that's kind of what I have there. So.
My name is Tom McFarland. We have an operation just north of Salmon, a little place called Carmen. We have a couple of BLM permits and some forest permits. We have been using virtual fence on the one BLM permit, an area of roughly 9,000 acres. We've been doing that for 2 years. It's a 3-month permit, but we operate it by putting pairs on it for 2 months in early summer, mid-May to mid-July, and then we bring those cows home and then go back on the same range with dry cows around the 1st of October. So we use the virtual fence with both pairs and dry cows later. That picture there, and what we found was really, really important was the training. Our first experience with training, and we put them on, it was roughly 30 to 40 acres, but it was somewhat narrow, 2-bench layers, and those cows would hit one fence, get shocked, even though there were hard fences there. They would kind of bounce off each other and kind of went into a flight mode. So we shut down the fence immediately that first day and then moved to the area you can see on the picture of roughly 250 to 300 acres of dry sagebrush hill ground. And it was a whole different response. So if you can on that training, those perimeter boundaries, when you first start, if you have something hard fenced there, either a fence or a natural boundary, it really helps to start out where the cows have a visual. Watch the tight corners. If they come into a tight corner and then they get shocked and then bounce into the other one and they get it a couple times in a row, then they kind of go in that small part of their brain and that flight zone, and takes them a while to settle down. And for us, the whole thing with this is to save labor, but also management, get more out of the cow. The first time also, we had just a few uncollared cows. We had a few cell cows there that we were going to grab when we moved them to the range, and that was a giant mistake. Those cows drifted and tempted the others. Don't make sure every cow in that training area is collared. That's a overview of the Badger Springs allotment. In the spring, like I say, that does not, I wish that showed the virtual fence lines, but it doesn't. And again, it's roughly 9,000 acres. It has some pretty steep terrain on some of it, and the riparian areas tend to be kind of down in the narrower valleys. Oh, this is a little video. It shows a collared cow, and I don't know how to play it on this. It shows the connection on the cow. You can see we have gentle cows. They're eating on a bale of hay. Where you see the blue arrow there, that land isn't grazed by us. It's grazed by our neighbors, but they were collared cows. If you can see the difference in grazing there, you can see that distinct line as it runs from the top of that little ridge line down into the valley. That land that wasn't grazed, that was separated out, is BLM land, and it had been sprayed the fall before for cheatgrass. The land on the bottom of the screen is private land, not our land, but it was grazed by collared cows, and that was a virtual fence line. So you can see how well in that situation there that it maintained that grazing line. As far as range management and cattle movement, again, those boundary fences, if you can, really look carefully at what a natural migration for a cow is and use those natural boundaries as much as you can if you don't have a hard fence there. And we have found that really helps with their distribution, but it also, we can't use real small pastures because of the lack of water. So they're larger areas. We did find that you still do need to go out there and horseback or however you do it, redistribute those cows to some areas. And if you'll put that extra effort in, then it all works better. We had hoped to have better riparian management, and we did some, but it was somewhat limited. Again, like I said before, our riparian areas tend to be kind of in small, narrow canyons. And if you have too many lines, boy, you can panic those cows, get those cows shocked, and the overall result is a cow that's not settled and grazing like she should. So we had some success, but it's still limited. I think some of those riparian areas still need, I think if they had a hard fence where they maybe got an audible at the outside of the hard fence, and then you could limit that hard fence. It wouldn't have to be a 4 or 5 wire. If you just had 3 rails or 3 steel bars, that would be with the assistance of the virtual fence that would do it. This is an area where they did an enclosure with the virtual fence for a study area. And it was kind of, I apologize. This screen doesn't show the other fence boundaries. If you follow up that drainage to the top right, there's 2 water sources up there, and then those cows naturally come down that valley and then graze back underneath that enclosure. Even though that line was somewhat, it was a ways away from where their natural migrations normally are, that fence there really shut them down. And it took, the cows just did not, it was hard to understand, but they just did not want to work around that. In other areas, it worked fine. That one, that particular area, it didn't. This is just a one to give an overview of the one on the left of showing the cows. Those yellow cows are cows that we had update issues with. Their collars weren't working. And then that picture was at a point in time where we had a tank on that side. It's a steep side. It was the only tank on that side. And the grouping of those cows that day showed us that we had issues with that tank. And we went out and we had a drain valve that they had tromped out. And we wouldn't have went out that day had we not been able to see that picture. So it was hugely, hugely beneficial. Those cows were grouped. They weren't scattered. The picture on the right, on the left side of the picture, you can't see it. There's a virtual fence. Normally those cows go up by where the horse is. They hit an audible right there, and that was the end of the road. That draw, other than that one location, was kind of difficult to get across. So we had to stop and take the cows around because they got an audible where they weren't expecting it. The pros, there was some significant labor saving. On the northwest side of our allotment is what was called Tower Creek. It's all residential. The only way we have found prior to the callers to use that is we have to maintain all the fences for all those residential areas because it takes us less time to do that than it does to go and get the cows out of the small private areas. And then it also helped the relationships, us not having cows where they shouldn't be. So we had a significant labor savings there. Knowing where the cattle are at any given time, that helps. When you go to gather on some of the timbered sides, you know where they are. It's easy. That water line break that I talked about a bit ago was another example. We knew by looking at the picture that we had a water issue, and we got out there. The downside of that is when we got out there and found the water down, the cows were all dry. It was a limited water source, but we couldn't come back over the top with them because there was a virtual fence there. The cell service on that side is limited off the tower, and we didn't have enough time, we didn't think, to have those cows updated so we could get through the virtual fence to get them to another water source. The cows hung in there. It took about 24 hours to get enough water, but we made it through it. So it was a real plus that it told us we had a problem, but it was close to a problem when we couldn't get them out of there an easy way to get them to a quick water source. I definitely think there's probably some better range management from it. Most of our pastures are electric fence, hardwire electric fenced anyway, but the university, their monitoring showed some improvements. It's another one's the pros. It's real handy for locating errant cattle. Cons, there were some technology hurdles. Some of the cows didn't program right. Several times when we went to move, even though the cows had 2 to 4 days for updates, not all the collars are updated. We've had 2 times to get those cows out on an open face wait a half an hour where there's cell service and then wait a half an hour at least for the collars to update. This summer, we had one move where we were going to a different pasture and we had about 6 cows that hadn't updated. We managed to hold them in a loose bunch and then kind of get a few that had updated started through the V fence. And then the others kind of trickled and followed them. And then we just let the unupdated ones go back. So a few minor things like that, but you just have to be aware of it. I guess my biggest con is we had our young cows. I like to go to the hills in the fall when the calves are weaned. A lot of guys don't, but I like taking the heifers back out there. Our young cows, our first calf heifers did not do well this fall. They just were in a flight mode most of the time. It was kind of hard to understand why, and they grouped and did not do well. Now, normally the year before, when they're yearlings, we do go to the hills. This is speculation. It's not necessarily science-based. It's my personal feeling. I think if they had been collared as yearlings and went out the year before, and then the second year as heifers, those heifers, when they're calves, they followed a cow on the hill. They always followed a cow. Then all of a sudden they're a heifer, they've had a calf, and then they go out and they just didn't do well. And I think if had that training the year before, they probably would have done better. Again, some lessons learned and future recommendations. Watch the movement around those boundaries. If the cattle aren't behaving right, go out and check those boundaries. Get with your or your whoever's doing the tech. The university did our tech work, our boundary work. Get with them, change those boundaries, redistribute them manually. And the first time is not necessarily going to be right when you set those boundaries. I think a real good way to do it is if a person took a collar horseback and you went around when you set those boundaries and just check and make sure those cows are getting the audibles where they're supposed to. I think that could be of a real benefit. Again, the training them right. We had other cattle with our cattle. We weren't the sole permittee there that weren't trained adequately. They had 1-2 days of training and not the right shape or size of areas. Those cattle, they're good cattle, but without the proper training, they did not behave the way the properly trained cows did. So I think that training is really important. We found that larger area to be without any V corners. We found that to be very beneficial. And then again, when you establish those fences, use as many natural land features as you can and think about those natural movements of cattle, and don't take a fence and put it around a steep hillside in the middle of a steep hillside. That cow, she starts falling.
I lost sound. Scott or Benton, can you hear us?
Yeah, we can hear you, Shannon.
Okay, go ahead, Tom.
Okay.
Let's see, I need backup.
Yeah. And again, don't assume that they're going to do everything for you. You still need to go redistribute those cattle sometimes. We kind of failed once in our spring grazing this year, and they were kind of hung up in an area, and had we went out and been a little more on the job, it would have worked much better both for the land and the cattle. Yeah. And again, we really appreciate working with the BLM and the University of Idaho, Joel and Alan, the people we work directly with. They were there 7 days a week. Anytime we called, they were there to adjust or do something. And that shows a picture of the bulls. The bulls are a little interesting collar. They don't to collar. They don't have much neck, and we had a little trouble keeping those collars on.